This is Notes on Quotes. I'm Stephen Harrison. And the premise of this series is I'm simply talking to really interesting people about a quote that's meaningful to them. People like my guest today, Dr. Kathleen Smith. Kathleen is the author of Everything Isn't Terrible: Conquer Your Insecurities, Interrupt Your Anxiety, and Finally Calm Down. Kathleen is a licensed therapist and a mental health writer who lives in Washington, D.C. And although we recorded this interview before the coronavirus pandemic, I think that the quote that Kathleen picks has a lot of resonance in this particular time and with the anxiety that a lot of us are facing during this period of shelter in place. Hey, before we get started, please subscribe to the Notes on Quotes podcast and please leave us a review. You can follow the show's Instagram @Notes on Quotes, and you can follow me, Stephen Harrison, on Twitter and other social media channels. If you're interested, you can read some of my writing in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Slate. And don't forget, you can read the print versions of all of these interviews at notesonquotes.com. And with that, enjoy the show. Welcome to the show.
I'm excited to be talking with you.
Okay, so what quote are we going to be chatting about today?
So my quote is from Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote a book that is still very popular today called Man's Search for Meaning. And the quote is, "Live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now."
Oh, what a great quote. And Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, that's one of the ones that the book was recommended to me many times. And then now that I've read it, I find myself recommending it to other people. Is that a book that's a favorite of yours?
Yeah, and it's one that I always recommend to my therapy clients if they don't have any particular agenda, because it really just sparks and promotes so much thinking about sort of the meaning in their own life and their day-to-day life, and is just a wonderful jumping off point for thinking about, you know, what motivates you and how you interact with other people and in your daily work. So it's just a great little, very short book to read if you just want to promote some interesting thinking in your day-to-day life.
Well, Kathleen, out of all the quotes you could have picked, why is it this one that resonated with you?
Well, I think it really sums up the work that I try and do with people as a therapist, and the work I'm always trying to do on myself, which is to know yourself so well that you can predict what I call your autopilot, to predict how you'll perform in your relationships and in challenging situations if you're not paying attention to sort of what we're programmed to do to kind of keep things calm and coast through challenges, and to consider whether or not we really need that in any given situation, or whether we want to be sort of a better, different version of ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And Viktor Frankl says to live this life as if you were living for the second time. You write about in your book about this concept of the astronaut's view, or taking the astronaut's view of life. Can you talk a little bit about that concept?
Usually in our relationships, we tend to stay focused on seeing things from our perspective. We love to paint other people as villains or heroes or different characters in our story, right? And so taking the astronaut's view is sort of hovering above yourself and everyone else and seeing how we affect each other, especially when we're anxious, to see the system at work and how we are constantly just reacting to other people's reactions, right? And to be able to be curious about that puts you in a different place, because you're not just on that autopilot. You're not just feeding into the same dynamics that you always engage in. You're able to ask yourself, is there a different path here? Is there a different choice in how I respond to this annoying person or this really difficult problem?
Yeah, on the subject of curiosity, one of the things you write about is how you tell your clients that you're curious about how they're going to solve different problems. Rather than giving them advice as a therapist, you express curiosity to them. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between giving advice versus curiosity?
Yeah, so curiosity puts the focus on the other person's capability, right? So I'm not lending any of my own thinking maybe in that moment or my own capability as a human. It's focusing on, what is it in you that is a resource to you as you navigate this challenge, and what is your thinking that's going to be helpful for you? Because, as a therapist, I only have access to so little information, right? Like I only have one or two people's usually perspectives. And I don't have the lifetime of experience dealing with that situation that they do. So, the arrogance of me assuming that my thinking is going to solve a problem, it just usually is not helpful. But if I'm calm and I'm curious and just genuinely interested in how a person is going to navigate their life, I think that it is contagious and that people start to get interested in the problem versus just being anxious or afraid of it. And, I talk about this in the book that engages a different part of the brain, the part that's uniquely human versus that, what I call the lizard brain that we all have that just wants to fight or flee a situation. So, if I am doing my job correctly, I'm very, very interested. If I am anxiously fixing and forcing, solutions on people, then I'm probably not going to be very effective or helpful to them.
As I was reading that, I was wondering how I would take it as a patient if the therapist said that I wasn't going to offer advice. I was just going to express curiosity. Do you ever have patients say to you, no, just tell me what to do?
Well, I never outright say, by the way, I'm never going to give you advice, because first of all, I'm sure I'm going to slip and offer a solution, right? And then it's not that I never share my thinking. It's just that it's not automatic, right? That I give the person a chance to use their own mind and their own capacity first, right? Now, that, like you said, that doesn't mean that people won't say, just tell me what to do or fix this for me. But how do we respond when people tell us what to do? Like, we usually don't like it very much. And so even though people may say that they just want to be directed or want a solution, I mean, just the evidence I've seen, and that it's usually not particularly helpful.
Certainly not helpful in the long run if you're trying to teach people to kind of manage their own lives.
Yeah, that's the goal. The goal is not to come to me forever.
You mentioned this concept earlier called the lizard brain, and I was thinking about that in the connection with this quote, because I think if we were living as Viktor Frankl suggests for the second time, then we would probably be less reactive, less reliant on that lizard brain. And I was wondering, how much do you think we can blame our inability to live a thoughtful life, kind of a premeditated or meditative life, on sort of like our evolutionary development, which sort of makes us so nervous in all these situations?
Yeah, I think an important point to remember is that our lizard brain is really useful, right? We wouldn't have evolved to have these very quick responses to stress, right, if they didn't work really well a lot of the time. Right? Like fleeing or fighting something can work, right? And so I think recognizing that it is adaptive sometimes and that we do have these quick responses for a reason, but when does that get in the way of a different response, right? And I think it's so easy to think of it in terms of good and bad, but it's so much more complicated than that. How do you at least get a heartbeat's worth of time to think about what you want to do before that automatic lizard action kicks in, right? Because it can be very useful, but the more choice you have in the matter, I think allows for more flexibility. So I think that's a really good point. These are not bad responses. Evolution has provided us with these tools for a reason, but when do they get in the way?
And maybe one scenario where they are setting where they sometimes get in the way is with our family. Why is it so difficult to manage our emotions in the family environment?
Yeah, well, the boundaries between yourself and other people in your family are so thin, right? Our ability to think for ourselves and decipher our feelings from our family's feelings, it's just harder to do because, we assume that everyone in our family should think the same things we do, right? Or have the same responses to challenges. And it's sort of, if you imagine it in your mind, it's just sort of this like overlapping Venn diagram of humans, right? And being able to kind of separate yourself from that and to be a part of your family, but also be a person who thinks and chooses for yourself. To me, that's the lifelong goal. That's the lifelong work, because if you can do it in your family, then you can do it pretty much anywhere.
Well, going back to the quote here, the quote again is, "So live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now." As I mentioned at the top, I really love Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. It's one that I recommend all the time. But at the same time, something that I'm trying to do on the show is sometimes be a little critical of the quotes in the series. And
Sure.
And here's one thought I had, that if we were to live as Viktor Frankl said for the second time, as if we were living for the second time, I'm wondering if that might almost make us somewhat overly cautious, or perhaps kind of fail to live in the moment if we had that sort of retrospective view. What are your thoughts on that?
One way I think of it, and I don't think that this is what Viktor Frankl had in mind, but this is how I've kind of taken the quote and run with it, is that we are actually living out things not only a second time, but a 99th time, a 1,000th time, right? Especially when it comes to our relationships. And that we have the privilege that we make the same mistakes over and over again. So we are, in fact, living scenarios for the, multiple or the nth time, right? Most of our day, right? Most of the challenges that we're up against are similar things that we've experienced in the past. So we do have the privilege of, saying, like, okay, this is my 3,000th phone call with my mother where she, asked me, if I've graduated yet, if her plans fit. And so this is my 3,000th opportunity to think about whether I want to snap at her or not, or be honest and thoughtful in my response, right? So, so I don't think of it as a matter of being cautious. I think of it as a matter of recognizing that most challenges are experiences that are similar to things we've been up against in the past, and that you will, if you act wrongly, you will get a second time and a third time and a 20th time. Not always, but a lot of the time, especially in relationships with people close to you. And so that's actually a really cool thing, that you can actually fail a whole bunch of times and go in for another round, right? And see if you can do something differently. So I don't think that Viktor Frankl was trying to say that, but that's what I take from it.
Well, these quotes tend to take on a life on their own, and that's just fantastic. I'm so glad you mentioned that, by the way, Kathleen, because I was thinking almost like a reincarnation experience, living your whole life. But what you're talking about is the opportunity to make a change for those repeat experiences that you have over and over.
Yeah. I mean, a different way of reading the quote might be, as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you were about to act, like at this Thanksgiving, or you acted as last holiday the way you're about to do now, and we have that data. We can look back into the past and say, what did I do and how effective was that? Do I want to live in this, Groundhog Day scenario of, acting the same way every time I'm anxious, or can I flip the switch a little bit?
A part of the book that resonated with me, or that it hit close to home, was your section on dealing with technology and cell phone use. I'm interested as a therapist, like, how often is it coming up that you're dealing with clients or helping clients who have sort of a cell phone addiction, or kind of that repeat experience with how they interact with their cell phones?
I don't think of it as like a separate addiction. I think of our technology use as just reflecting what it is that we already do and what we're going to do, whether we have a phone in our hand or not. It just makes it easier to act as wrongly as we are about to act, right? So if my go-to response when I'm mad at someone is to complain to somebody about it to calm myself down, how much easier is it to do that with a phone, right? I can text somebody right away and they can say, oh my goodness, they're such a jerk, right? So, I talk about this in the book, that our phones just sort of enhance those autopilot behaviors because they are such an easy distraction or an easy way to kind of pull other people into our drama.
Well, you have this great line in the book, and if I can just quote you very briefly here, you say, quote, "These days, know thyself means know thy texting habits."
Yeah, I mean, it's such a wealth of data, right? If you, you don't have to imagine how you acted in certain scenarios. You have the literal, you have the actual words that you use and how you responded. So being able to look back and, sort of seeing in real time how you responded to a person being difficult or to a problem that you had, you can say, oh, was this effective? Was this a response? Did this get the outcome that I wanted? Did I feel calmer? Was I being mature? So I always encourage people to look through their Twitter feed, their texts, their phone usage habits, to just consider all that data and to see what was useful and what actually, generated more anxiety in the long run.
One of the other things I wanted to ask you about was this naming of anxiety. One thing you mentioned in the book is that you named your anxiety Carl, which I found interesting. Why is it helpful to you or anyone else to name your anxiety?
Well, I think naming it made me take it a little bit less seriously and allowed me to kind of laugh at a little bit because, the anxious thoughts that we have tend to make the stakes seem very high or seem to be utter truth, right? Whereas if you put another name or another face to it, you kind of can see the ridiculousness or the irrationality of it, right? So if I'm thinking, I'm in a room and I'm thinking, everyone here finds you really annoying, Kathleen. And then I take that quote and I go, Carl thinks that everyone finds really annoying. Like maybe Carl seems like a little bit of a jerk and doesn't know what he's talking about, right? I think it's just one way of kind of putting it in perspective and just sort of unmasking like how serious it actually is.
Right. And it makes me think again of the reptilian brain that's all inside us. Maybe we were designed to fear, wild animals or predators and things like that. And to name your anxiety Carl, I guess, kind of helps your brain perhaps realize that it's actually not the same thing as a life and death scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk about this in the book too. It just you have to look around and see whether there's a real fire or not. And I think putting a name to your anxiety can kind of help you see, like, okay, this is not a level 10, or however you want to measure it, dangerous scenario.
Another concept that comes up in your book a lot is not letting your pseudo self kind of run the show. I think of the pseudo self sometimes on social media, but it can also come up at work. What do you think of this concept of the pseudo self, maybe in the context especially of this quote?
Yeah, so I think one thing I always pay attention to when I'm thinking about how I behave automatically is how I borrow confidence from other people or how I borrow capability from other people. So when I am distressed, do I constantly ask people to reassure me and tell me that I'm doing a good job? Do I ask my husband to fix something or handle something right away because that's the easiest way to just deal with it? And all of those behaviors kind of boost up my sense of self in the moment, but they also can leave it very vulnerable because if people don't reassure me or my husband doesn't jump in and fix something, right? Then all of a sudden that leaves me, in a very vulnerable place and my mood, my functioning can kind of take a nosedive. So paying attention to where I get my calmness from, where I get my confidence from, is that from the outside in? Is it from the inside out? And, it's human to rely on others for support and help. That's a very normal, perfectly healthy thing. But when it becomes your only way of dealing with challenges, you really don't grow as a person. And so, if I'm, thinking in terms of the quote, I have to ask myself, okay, how am I going to act right now? How have I acted in the past? What has been my automatic way of relying on those around me? And the theory I was trained in, it's called borrowing self. So like, when am I borrowing self from other people? And how do I maybe build up myself instead of doing that?
I think on the other end of the spectrum from borrowing yourself from other people is to having a self that's sort of based on your principles. And I was thinking before the show that, if someone had the opportunity to live their life for the second time, they might live a more principled life. You have this great line in your book that says something to the effect of principles are sexy. Why is it that principles are so important?
Principles provide the blueprint that is the alternative to your anxious functioning. So if you're actually guided by your best thinking and your actual beliefs, that's what your principles look like in real time, And I think you could never 100% get there, but any opportunity throughout the day, you can be guided by your best thinking instead of your anxiety. I think I would call that a win. You're probably going to be a little bit calmer, maybe, at least in the long run. I wouldn't get too much into Man's Search for Meaning, but I do think that is part of the therapy that Frankl developed, and some of his thoughts coming out of writing that book is that people who seem to have principles kind of did better on a day-to-day basis.
And he's writing, of course, about this, at least for a large part of the book, about his pretty traumatic experience in the Holocaust and the survivors or the people he was with in the concentration camp, many of whom kind of demonstrated those principles. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think, he found that people who were focused on how they were going to respond to the almost impossible seeming challenges in front of them seemed to do better, And so I think that's useful for all of us to think about is how do you stay focused on yourself and how you want to respond to a situation versus how do you control everyone else or prevent the situation from happening, right? Which may be impossible. It's that I focus that's really important.
One thing that I think some people might consider if they had the opportunity to live their life for the second time and they had made mistakes, per Viktor Frankl's quote, is maybe they might make a career change. And I was interested in your chapter on career change in the book. What are some of the things that you would advise anybody to think about before making a significant career change?
Well, one of the things I talk about is to know the facts, because so much of our understanding of different careers is based on, I talk about this in the book, television, fantasy, right? Some vague understanding of what people actually do on a day-to-day basis. And I think the more armed you are with the facts, even if they're disappointing or contradict that original thinking, I think that's really useful because people don't often take the time to gather the facts because they want to clutch on to that fantasy of this new thing, right? And then to also just to think flexibly, right? I think a lot of times when people want to make a career jump, they want to do it in a particular way as quickly as possible. And that might not actually set them up for success in the long run. So, being willing to sit with the discomfort that a big change can take time, and then it won't necessarily look exactly like the picture you originally had in mind. I think people who are able to think flexibly about that are better able to make that kind of transition. But we love to just make these dramatic changes, right, and fix everything as quickly as possible. That's what we love to do as humans a lot of the time.
You've got this great example of someone who's making a dramatic change in the book, someone who's wanting to go from being a lawyer to an art therapist and sort of jump immediately into that new role.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a lot of clients who come in and I think they think that making the change is going to calm everything down, but you carry yourself with you in any environment, right? And I think recognizing that working on self is a lot of the time more effective than just changing your environment.
Kathleen, one of the overarching themes from your book is the role of maturity, and kind of my reading of the Viktor Frankl quote is that if someone had the opportunity to live their life for the second time, they might live with a lot more maturity. They might be maybe make more mature decisions. But I was just interested in your take. Do you think that we perhaps as a society do not place adequate emphasis on the concept of maturity?
Yeah, it's not a sexy word. You don't see a lot of self-help books that, nobody comes into therapy saying, I want to be more mature, right? They want to calm down. They want to have better relationships. They want to be happier, right? Those sound much more appealing. But I think maturity is great because it does, help you think, more clearly in challenging situations. It does enrich your relationships because you're not so allergic to everybody else's anxiety, right? You are able to accomplish goals more effectively because you're focused on kind of being the person you need to be. So I think it's just because it's the long game, right? Nobody wakes up and is more mature tomorrow, by a huge degree, but maybe you could be a lot happier or a lot calmer if you do something dramatic, right? So I'm a huge fan of the word, but I recognize how unappealing it is, even for me a lot of the time.
And one thing you write in the book or note in the book is that people tend to end up with someone who's about the same level of maturity as they are.
Yeah, I mean, we love to think that our partners are less mature than we are, or we love to think that we're less mature, but the idea is that relationships are reciprocal, and we tend to, gravitate towards people who respond in a way to anxiety that fits with how we respond, right? So if I love to take over and over function for people, I might fit with somebody who likes to let me do that, right? And that doesn't mean that I'm more mature than they are or vice versa, right? It's a reciprocal relationship. So, I think just acknowledging that can be useful for people. It's a humbling idea, I think.
Kathleen, your book is called Everything Isn't Terrible, Conquer Your Insecurities, Interrupt Your Anxiety, and Finally Calm Down. And I was interested, Kathleen, in sort of your personal life and maybe your experience with anxiety leading up to the writing of this book.
Yeah, so I was trained in a theory called Bowen theory, which Murray Bowen was sort of the father of family psychotherapy. And I learned this theory, and it made a huge difference in my own life. And I wanted to be able to write down what some of that work looks like and be able to hand it to my clients and other people when they asked me what they wanted to read. And so kind of how the book emerged was that I started sitting down every week and, I wrote an essay or some thoughts about how I was working very slowly on becoming more mature and less anxious in my own life. Keywords, very slowly. And I still write it. It's a free newsletter that I write called The Anxious Overachiever. And I found that it was just a great practice for me to sit down and write about this exact Viktor Frankl quote, what it was I was trying to do, that it was a little bit different than what I had done the day before, and how successful I was, and sort of where the roadblocks were. And I think people appreciated it because I think therapy is such a mystery a lot of the time. People don't, for many reasons, but I think people are really curious to see what the sort of day-to-day work looks like when you're trying to be, a little bit calmer and a little more mature. And yeah, so I just wanted to tell some of the stories about how other people were kind of able to do that, and how I've been trying to do it myself as well. Because I do think that, it is a long, lifelong effort, but it's any amount of progress is totally worth it.
Yeah. And you mentioned your newsletter. Where might someone go to sign up for that newsletter?
Yeah, they can just go to my website, KathleenSmith.net. There's a pop-up. There's links. You literally can't miss it even if you want to. So my website's probably the best place for that.
Awesome. Well, Kathleen, I've really enjoyed the conversation talking about Viktor Frankl, your book, and also your newsletter. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Notes on Quotes. Again, I'm Stephen Harrison, and this series is a team effort with audio production by Jason Cady. Our transcriptions are done by Sarah Baum of Sharp Copy Transcription. Our theme song is Water and Bridges by Joshua Heffernan. And our podcast cover art was done by Jacqueline Parsons. Check out our website, notesonquotes.com, where you can get the print versions of all of these interviews. Subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you choose, and please leave us a review. Don't forget to follow us on social media and Instagram, where our handle is Notes on Quotes. Thanks again.